I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, part 6 of our 10-part series, Best Literature.
Jackbooting our way step by step through the 20th century.
Decade by decade. So this is the 1950s, 1950 to 1959, an interesting period in mainland China. The PRC establishes itself. And what happens to literature, Rob?
Literature begins to turn to doo-doo a little bit, as it always does when you have an authoritarian regime that decides to control all elements of arts and letters, things like that.
The dictatorship of the proletariat is what you're supposed to call it, Rob.
I'm sorry, dictatorship of the proletariat. Thank you for correcting me. The republic. It's a republic. Everyone knows this. The People's Republic. Anyway,
just to get technical, a dictatorship can be a republic.
Okay.
A republic just means
but
it's not a monarchy.
Its literature is still doo-doo, one way or the other. Now, but here's the interesting thing about this period. So, the Maoist era goes from 1949 to about 1976 when Mao dies. During that period, if you asked us, what is the best literature produced during that period? That's going to be a tricky question to answer.
Chirp, cricket, chirp.
Exactly. It's like asking our favorite Nickelback song or our favorite Toyota commercial or something. It's like, well, I don't like any of it.
Toyota's hot, hot, hot.
Yeah, you can definitely stop. But having said that, the 19th of the decades that produce literature we don't like, the 1950s actually has some of the more interesting, and I'll get to my pick in a second as an explanation of that. But let's ground the listener here. So the Civil War,
some of the less uninteresting, I would say.
Yeah, some of the less uninteresting. Fair enough. As in, there are more dynamic Toyota commercials than others.
So really quickly, Rob, I think we should just ground our listener historically. 1949, the Communist Party takes over all of mainland China except for, all of mainland China. And then you have kind of 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how you count it, that things actually work pretty well. There's a lot of optimism in the PRC, and then things kind of go to
HE double hockey sticks. We said that in unison. I can't believe we just did that.
The listener can't see the matching sequin outfits that we're also wearing.
Jumpsuits, velour jumpsuits.
But so things get quite bad after maybe 1956, 1957. Really, you have the anti-rightist campaign in 1956, I believe, and then that turns into the Great Leap Forward, which is an economic disaster. It's probably one of the worst economic disasters in the 20th century in the world.
Yes,
and things continue on from cycling from bad to worse after that. But the first 5 years of this decade is actually not that bad.
Right.
There are some campaigns against wealthy landlords and other people, but really it's the PRC is not worse than a lot of other regimes at this time.
No.
And that's when my writer is actually writing. So the writer that I'm looking at his name is Fei Li Wen. He was born in Shanghai in 1930. He is working in factories, and after the establishment of the PRC, because the PRC wants to cultivate a particular kind of writer, that is, they want to have workers writing. So Fei Li Wen he's writing some articles. He does several fairly, I don't know if you could call them popular works, but they were popular at the time in this kind of very restrictive environment. One of them being a work that's highly anthologized called 1 Year. And it's not great literature. I don't think, Rob, you and I have actually discussed this several years ago on the podcast, but I don't think it ever aired. This is not aesthetically pleasing writing. I think both of us agreed that Zhang Ailing in the 1940s was writing both beautiful works and works that were kind of interesting in terms of plot.
Yes.
This plot is kind of, his writing is kind of like something that you would expect from a factory worker.
It's very formulaic.
It's formulaic, and it's very mechanical in terms of the style. And I think that Fei Li Wen is interesting, not so much because he's a good writer, but really because he represents kind of what the communists were trying to do during the 1950s before things went off the rails. Like, they're trying to cultivate workers who are also writers. And I think that the problems that Fei Li Wen had, not in terms, I mean, in terms of his writing, not in terms of his politics, really exemplify the tension that the communists faced starting out, that they want to empower workers. They want to empower these people who never were really writers, who never had the opportunity to be writers, into becoming writers.
So the story you mentioned, 1 year, is... I mean, it doesn't take long to summarize, right? This guy is out of commission. He's a factory overseer, and he's out of commission for a while. And he comes back, and his once protege, this young woman, has surpassed him. She knows more than he does. She's better with the equipment than he is. And at first, he takes it personally and is just thinking, well, who do you think you are, you young whippersnapper? But then, as any good communist cadre does, he comes to realize the old must learn from the new. That you know, the student surpassing the teacher is like the greatest victory, right? And so he decides, I'm going to be a good communist, and I'm going to learn from her. The end.
And there's an interesting gender dynamic in this story, and that the kind of old guy is coming in and feeling like he has something to prove to this young woman who is besting him,
yes,
to be honest. And then he actually learns that he should have some humility.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting gender dynamic there, because one of the first things the communists did is they actually wrote a marriage law, a law that sort of empowered women to allow them to be divorced and allow them to not be abused. And so this is kind of, it's being written by a man, but it's embodying these kind of CCP hopes and dreams for gender equality.
Yeah. And I should point out here that this is remarkable. This is worth remarking. I mean, this is something that Chinese reformers since the beginning of the 20th century had been fighting for.
And Mao, actually, one of the first things he published is on gender. It's the Suicide of Miss Zhao, I think. He's publishing this in the 1920s, before he's anybody. Before he's Mao.
Before he's Mao with a capital M and on posters.
And so Mao was very much concerned about gender dynamics. And I would actually suggest, and one of the reasons I chose this story is because the interesting gender line. One of the things I think the CCP does really well is gender equality. Like, if you look across Asia, China in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is actually one of the best countries in terms of gender equality. I have a lot of other criticisms of China from that period, but in terms of gender equality, I think they do really well. And that's this story, again, we were talking about it at the beginning of the podcast. The story and all of the literature that comes out of this period is not good. We don't sit at home reading it at night in bed. There's nothing that is really super interesting. But and we've talked about this before on the podcast, Rob. There is still an importance to reading this literature, and that is that it represents a time and a place. And these stories were anthologized and read by, a billion people.
Right. And I want to stress this point too, because when I was getting a master's degree in China, no one even then would read this period, 49 to 76, or 49 to 66, really, until the Cultural Revolution. There was a whole class dedicated to that, but no one wanted to take it. And that's the tendency you see all over the place, is just to assume, well, if it was influenced by Mao and it's both basically propaganda, let's not pay attention to it, except when you do. Like you mentioned, you do notice some interesting things. There's some gender equality in this story that you don't see in a lot of stories even prior to this. What does that mean? And since we're talking about gender equality, I'll throw my writer into the mix. In probably the most popular work of literature in the 50s, Yang Mo's Song of Youth. It also became a very successful film in 1959. Of the literature in the Maoist era, that, as we already have said many times, is not very good, this is one of the best. There are actual times in this story and in the film as well when you go, wow, that was actually a fairly moving scene. Interesting.
I don't know about
Well,
that,
that's why.
but-
Well, have you seen the film? I forget.
I have, yeah.
You have seen the film.
Yeah.
So there's a part in the film, and I'll just give it a brief plot because, again, it's fairly easy to summarize. It's a classic story. Young woman lost her way, depressed, not know what to do with her life, looking for a mentor, finds one. In this case, in the body of the Communist Party. Now, the story is not set in the 50s, which is important because if it was, there wouldn't be much to talk about that was good.
There's no tension there.
It's set in the 30s when the communists are fighters. They've gone through the long march. They've gotten themselves mobilized and organized, and they're the ones who are ready for the future, more or less, right? This is important to remember because the first couple of years in the 50s were okay, but the 50s did not end well, right? So you need a PR campaign to rescue you. You got to have somebody go, "Yay, right, look, we went off the rails and it was a disaster," right? But it wasn't always a disaster, right? When the party was at its best, that part can still come back. How does it come back? It comes back if the young people get involved. That's the novel, right? There's an old guard who's taught all this stuff, but the people who are really going to carry it forward are the young people. That's why it's Song of Youth, right? And there is, I mentioned, the reason I asked you a second ago, Lee, about watching the movie. Do you remember the scene? It's a really famous scene where she and a friend that's the end. He's giving me the fist up salute over there, but that's the end of it. Anyway, but the young woman who's the protagonist, who's trying to find her way, etc., and has found a mentor, she ends up in jail with a friend of hers, and they meet an old guard cadre, someone who's been in the fight a long time. This older woman who's down there. You remember that scene?
I don't remember that scene.
Okay, it made a huge impact on you, I can tell. She gives them her sort of story. And it did, soaring martial music, loud choirs, the whole thing, fair enough. But it's a very well done scene. The actress who plays that character is very good at what she does. And there are moments where you go, okay, fair enough. That's an actual movie scene. A little ham-handed, but, that's well done. This is the reason I chose this work in particular. Yang Mo, so far as I know, she may have written more stuff, but this is the only one she's really known for. This is crucial. This is a PR coup for the Communist Party because they've got a disaster to recover from, and this is one of the works that helps to restore their image.
Yeah, Rob, I don't know how much of a propaganda coup Yang Mo's work was in terms of rescuing the Great Leap Forward, because it comes out mid Great Leap Forward as people are starving and dying. But I think you're still right. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on here. She writes this kind of paradigmatic story of how communists see themselves, and I just want to point out that this story kind of gets recycled in a variety of forms. Jiang Qing, who's Mao's fourth wife, who is producing a lot of art in the 1960s and 1970s, and she also sort of kind of takes over the government for a little while in the 1960s and 1970s. She actually produces several operas that are largely kind of follow a similar formula of, old cadre male who teaches the young woman to take control of the gun. Please read that as a phallic symbol. And then kind of like the woman becomes the hero. So there is this interesting gender dynamic. I don't know of too many stories before the PRC where you have women playing this kind of empowered role. And I think that's the thing that we should take from both of these stories.
Yeah. It's women taking an empowered role, but young people taking an empowered role as well. They're both not just women, but young women.
And that's important in terms of a Confucian society like China, because previously, youth had kind of been disregarded. I mean, obviously, the May 4th movement is very much about youth and sort of rejuvenating China, but in a lot of ways, kind of youth in Chinese history has been sidelined, just like women have.
Well, and even in the May 4th, there's no real focus on you and I talked about in our podcast on the teens. I talked about an essay by Li Dajiao called just youth, basically, 青年. But the stories in the fiction themselves don't always go there. They often talk just about the conflict between old and new societies, traditional values, etc. They're putting it front and center here. And this is something they'll stress throughout the Maoist era: youth, 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 youth. To some extent, even today, right? But this leads to Yang Mo's novel, which is, and I want to point this out before we start to wrap this up. It's, stop me if you think I'm wrong here. It's the only work I can think of in the Maoist era that's a real novel, like a long, several hundred-page work that attempts to do what a novel is supposed to do, which is to have character development and change and growth over time. By the late 60s, they're not writing really anything anymore.
By that point, it's really too dangerous to write
exactly.
anything, because anything you produce could become politically incorrect tomorrow, and you could be
right.
The dunce cap could be put on your
exactly.
head. I think that you're right. I mean, I wouldn't say that there aren't any novels during this period, because Dingling is actually still writing some novels during this period. I don't think they're very good, and I've said this a couple of times.
Broken record!
I don't think any of this is very good, but it is worth pointing out that Dingling, she won the second place in the Stalin Prize.
Isn't that hilarious?
And there is something going on in the development in both of these stories. There is character development, which is saying a lot, because a lot of the stuff that's produced in the late 1960s doesn't have that. Right. It's just kind of agate-prop.
And we'll get there later. But I want to close maybe with this thought that there are efforts in the Maoist era to produce art and literature like what was being produced in the May 4th and later. It did not succeed because I think you and I would both agree you really can't combine artistic experimentation with political towing of the line propaganda, right? There's sort of antithetical elements. But the fact that an attempt is made at all, I think, is fascinating, because a novel like this, a giant novel, is not the kind of thing you take out to China's still mostly agrarian culture, right? You don't just take a several hundred-page novel out into the fields and say, hey, everybody read this. Folk songs? Definitely. Short poems? Yeah, sure, why not? Films? Go for it. But long novels? Not really. So the fact that they're even still trying this means that they're still looking for some kind of artistic continuity. That's not going to last long, but it's interesting that there's an effort at all by the late 50s.
I agree with you 100%, and I think that's a good place to end it.
I always like finishing when you agree with me.
Can I ask you something before we go, Rob?
Go. What
is your favorite Nickelback song?
Oh, man. Wow. It's funny, because in a way they're all the same songs, so you could almost say all of them, they all sort of flow together into one sort of homogeneous mass.
Which is kind of true of the literature of the 1950s.
Yeah, but the more trenchant argument is, which do you prefer, Maoist literature or Nickelback? And that one, that could get rough. That's a tough argument. As a reminder, as we close here, whatever podcast platform you use, leave us a review. Get the word out,
please,
and give us beer money through Patreon. Chinese Literature Podcast through Patreon, and we're also at Twitter, ChinLitPod, Instagram at ChineseLitPod. Send us an email too. It's easy to remember, Chinese Literature Podcast at Gmail. We absolutely love writing with people over Gmail. If you're out there and listening to this and we're emailing with you, thank you for participating. It's such a blast actually communicating with folks about this stuff.
That is when we're not in dissertation HE double hockey stick. Sometimes it'll be like 3 or 4 weeks before I get back to an email.
Yeah. If we do, we really are in the HE double hockey sticks.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
I agree.
In Maoist HE double hockey stick.
Agreed.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.